Hello and welcome to yet another edition of your weekly international current affairs program, Globewatch from the Cameroon Radio Television, with me, Charles Ebune. After the Millennium Development Goals, which pulled out of poverty nearly 1 billion people, came the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 a number currently being implemented by the entirety of the globe, championed by the United Nations and its 193 members. But there is a glimmer of even more hope in the horizon after the adoption by the United Nations last year of the Pact for the Future. What does it really entail for the common man striving for a better world where artificial intelligence, the digital divide and wars are almost colliding against each other at a time when one of the world's largest and greatest threats, climate change, is producing very mitigating results for the human being. My guest today on Globewatch is somebody who sat throughout the entire process of the adoption of the Pact for the Future. Dr. Nsah, welcome to Globewatch.
Thank you for having me, Charles.
We are roughly 8 billion people globally, and nearly 5 billion people use the internet on a daily basis. Basically, the digital experience is a huge one, and it's one of the key elements of the Summit of the Future, the Digital Compact. How do you unpack that?
Yeah, we live at a time when there are unprecedented shifts, very rapid shifts in technology, especially as exemplified by artificial intelligence, but also even a huge scramble for space and the usage of space among superpowers or even the other powers that are emerging. So all of this means that we have things that are potentially very helpful for humanity, but also come with huge risk. Some of the risks include annihilation of the human race, complete wipeout. Those are potentials that could come with AI. And so the Global Digital Compact is one of the annexes of the Pact of the Future that was adopted in New York on the 22nd of September during the Summit of the Future. And the other annex is the Declaration on Future Generations, and the two of them are annexed to a pact that seeks to envision a new multilateralism, or to reinvigorate, to put new life into multilateralism, because we are in a time of global tensions, global conflicts, with also potential implications that could lead us to repetitions of the past, like the First and the Second World Wars. So there is first that need, but also need to address long-term challenges, because it has also come to be realized and proven by scientists that a lot of the problems we face them because we approach them with short-termism.
When you look at the Millennium Development Goals, which for their 10 years or 15 years of experience, pulled nearly 1 billion people out of poverty. When you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, which will be ending in 2030, and 17 of them in number, one of the major criticisms of such processes was that they did not take from the bottom-top approach. Do you think that the Summit of the Future and the new Global Pact last year solved that problem? You were part of the process, meeting communities around the world.
Yes, I totally agree with your assessment of the shortcomings that we've experienced in these global agendas and visions, the Global Development Goals, and then the Millennium Goals, and now we are with the SDGs, and the deadline for the SDGs completion is very soon. It's 2030, because we're talking quite close to that. But what?
5 years from now.
Yeah, and so that is why the Pact for the Future is an opportunity. It brings hope and optimism, but there is also some nuances to be taken into consideration, because it provides us with tools to be able to avoid the pitfalls that we saw with the Millennium Development Goals. And even now, because with the SDGs, it has also come to be concluded that we are running behind schedule on nearly all the goals. And we are 5 years to the deadline for the Agenda 2030 and the SDGs. But what is positive news is that while the pact references the SDGs a lot, something that I don't particularly appreciate, but at least it gives us the tools and the mechanisms with which we can be able to draft and design new goals post SDGs in ways that are more long-term inclined. And so that is why I totally also agree that the processes are usually very top-down and including only multilateral negotiations between member states.
This time they moved from communities to communities, from countries to countries in nearly all the 193 member countries of the United Nations. When you listened to the voices and you were part of a delegation to Cameroon, when you listen to the local voices, the localized voices, do you sense that what was finally adopted at the UN General Assembly reflected the voices of the masses?
I would say just very partially, quite partially. The voices of the people went into the pact and its annexes, but in a very minimal way. And I also want to thank civil society for a job well done, because there are quite a number of things that were gathered from the grassroots that didn't make it to the final text, because no matter how much civil society and other stakeholders like academics, like experts and opinion leaders can have on that process, because it was negotiated within the UN system, it means that final decisions always came down to the level of member states. But however, what really gives us hope is the fact that the Pact of the Future emphasizes that nation states should now pick up foresight and futures thinking, which is a tool that is very, very appropriate for carrying out collective intelligence gathering within communities in what we call participatory foresight exercises. One example of a country that has done that successfully and which years ago was like on the sidelines but now is mainstreamed is Wales in the UK, because Wales was the first country to adopt an act of legislation in favor of future generations. But prior to doing that, they did a lot of work consulting the citizens of their country and finding out what they want. And so they designed a new vision for their country based very significantly on input from their citizens. And so we hope that because now foresight and futures has been emphasized in the pact, that if member states, civil society organizations, businesses, and we take a whole of society approach and we embrace foresight in addition to other forms of knowledge, we will be able to build more bottom-up responses to global challenges.
Currently, we have roughly 2 billion people, young people aged between 15 to 25 years or 24 years or so. One key element of the Summit of the Future is the Declaration on Future Generations. Are they a key component considered in that part? What is actually in that particular segment?
Yes, the declaration is critical and crucial because, in my opinion, the declaration is the most cross-cutting of. The Declaration on Future Generations is the most cross-cutting of the three components that make up the Pact for the Future. And why I say so is because we can read the Declaration on Future Generations as being another side of the coin of sustainability. Because we do all agree that there are billions of young people on Earth now, but particularly in the African continent. Africa is the youngest continent in terms of population. And if you take countries like Cameroon, the average age is somewhere around 18, 19. So what this means is that the world is aware of the huge challenges that await young people. And young people are also the closest people to the future generations. We have to address them in order to avoid a situation where, for example, instead of a demographic dividend on the African continent, we end up having an explosion because we have AI, which is beautiful, creating some jobs, but also eliminating thousands of jobs. And we already have a fundamental problem of unemployment on the African continent. So this means that we have to be able to think long-term and also think about the global demographic shifts, given the fact that the Western world is largely declining. They largely have old populations. So it means that every decision that we take, whether we are politicians or businessmen and women, whether we are civil society, whether we are traditional rulers, we need to think long-term. We need to think future generations and youth, because otherwise the choices that we make today, whether they are good choices, they are pleasurable choices, they have consequences for future generations. My
cameraman shooting this interview, just like yourself, were inside the United Nations Assembly Hall when the Pact of the Future was adopted, and just make my audience live the emotions which were inside. How was the ambience? How was the atmosphere? That of excitement, that of determination, that of frustration, or I don't know?
I think the hall was filled with optimism, and I almost went into tears. So I think the overall impression in that hall was that people were very hopeful, very optimistic, very determined, and very concerned about the well-being, the peace and security of the present and future generations. But there is a nuance that the context was not the very best, because we were gathered in New York at a time when raging conflicts are all over the world. Whether we take the case of Ukraine and Russia, or we take the Middle East, Israel and Palestine, or we take very forgotten conflicts in Africa, like in Sudan or in Cameroon and elsewhere, or in the DRC. So one thing that held people a little bit back, maybe people like me who are conscious of this, was that we were designing the future, and some people were not very much able to participate in that design process. And there was also a time when some 7 countries wanted to hold back because they proposed a last-minute amendment to the Pact of the Future. But luckily the world rose against that. So the world rose against that, and you see that the pact was adopted by almost unanimity, because with an overwhelming majority, and except only the 7 countries that had wanted to propose that last minute. So this tells you how optimistic.
There are so many thematics involved in the realization of the pact for the future. Of course, one of them is education. The other is artificial intelligence, which is people-oriented and positively impacting communities. One of them is, of course, infrastructure like road construction, renovating the seaports and whatsoever. And days after that, the President of the United Nations General Assembly, Philemon Yang, in an address to a select few talking about development challenges in Africa, said that developing countries globally, which are largely in Africa and some of them in Latin America, Asia, said they need roughly $192 billion yearly to attain the sustainable development goals by 2030. That is a gap not to be fulfilled, all right?
Yeah. And that is going to be one of, if we put away war and conflict, and we put away a potential disaster created by AI. I don't want to be very pessimistic. That's just one potential, but AI also has a lot of good advantages. But if we put away these first 2 categories of very existential threats, then the next thing that would be a serious stumbling block to realizing, to implementing the Pact of the Future is finance. Especially for the countries of the world that you've mentioned, which sometimes are now called the global majority, because we are demographically the highest in the world, and then also sometimes called the global south. Because we need climate finance. We need to address the climate crisis, because if we also put away the first 2 threats that I mentioned, the next worst existential threat on earth today is the climate crisis, the climate and ecological crisis. And it is only by addressing that crisis that we can be able to guarantee a future for future generations. But we cannot do that with that money. If you take the African continent, for example, we are blessed in Africa to have, for example, the Congo Basin, which is now the only net carbon sink on Earth, because even the Amazon, which is hyped a lot as being the first lung of the Earth, there are arguments as to whether it is still the first lung of the Earth, given that the Amazon has been considered as the first lung of the Earth and the Congo Basin as the second lungs of the Earth. And then we can maybe bring in now the tropical forests of Southeast Asia around the Benue Mekong River Basin. However, Africa has a lot to offer in terms of climate mitigation, because we have, for example, peatlands in the Congo Basin that are capable of sequestering about 3 years of global carbon emissions. We are talking only peatlands. We're not yet talking the capacity for our forest. But we are asked to keep these forests, we are asked to keep these peatlands to mitigate climate change for the world, and the world is not ready to compensate us for that. So, which means we really do need climate finance, and climate finance we are not begging. It is an obligation, because it has to do with injustice. There is climate and environmental injustice, and we are the most vulnerable continent so far, but also the continent that has contributed the least to the climate crisis.
By your training, you are a teacher and a bilingual teacher, and when you furthered your studies, research was basically in the arts of environmentalism and other research portfolio. And I'm glad that you are talking about environmental protection in particular and landing in the Congo Basin. One other key feature of the Pact for the Future is the climate change debate. And we also what transpired in Baku, Azerbaijan in the last United Nations Framework Conference on Climate Change. The world needs roughly $6 trillion by 2030 to adequately address the climate change issue. When you look at Africa and the Congo Basin in particular, do you think they are fairly treated in the whole global environment debate?
Absolutely no. Overall, the global south or the global majority receives very little climate finance, and is also the part of the world that needs climate finance the most. Because one thing about the climate crisis is that sometimes we think about it more in the present, but the injustices that have led to the climate crisis are things that have a significant historical background, leading back to the enslavement of Africans, passing through colonization to neo-colonization and green colonialism. Now, if we take all of this into perspective, and we also take into perspective the fact that the bulk of emissions come from industrialization in countries of the global north, most of which were colonizers, and then with exceptions of new powers now like China or Russia or India, etc., we come to the conclusion that it is not something that we've really contributed. Africa has contributed less than 4% of global emissions. But even within the global south, we are still the very least that receive climate finance. The Congo Basin and Africa as a whole, we are the least who receive climate finance. And this is something that African negotiators have been hammering on during conferences, but nobody seems to be paying attention.
You are just from a field trip in the forest in the Congo Basin area with the work of the Congo Basin Institute, probably financed and supported amongst others by Charles University and the University of Los Angeles. When you look the forest where probably you moved turning looking around, when you see at the deforestation going on, what actually did you see on the ground?
I will first say, yeah, the research we are conducting on the Congo Basin currently, in addition to work that I've also been doing which is called Congo Basin Futures, supported by the School of International Futures and the University of Cologne and UNESCO Most Bridges Coalition. There is now another project that we also work on, which is funded by the British Academy. And we are looking into how the different conceptualizations of time by indigenous and local communities in around basins, not only the Congo Basin, but also the Mekatong Bay in the UK and the North Walden Sea in Europe, how the way that different local and indigenous communities perceive and manage their time converge or diverge with the way that NGOs or state actors conceive of environmental conservation and protection. And wherever we've been, we can always, particularly in the case of the Congo Basin, the ongoing research is clearly demonstrating that there is a lot of things that are said that are not done. That the Congo Basin inhabitants, whether those of Cameroon or Congo that we've interacted all with, or Gabon and elsewhere, generally, particularly the indigenous people, there is a huge problem that they usually send to hierarchy request for their very basic social needs, and needs which we have created by evicting them from forest, and most of those needs, nearly all of them, are not met. And so there is a general feeling, and also there is a reality of frustration and objectives not met when it comes to inhabitants of these rich parts of the world, and who are very helpful for conserving them.
Very soon the interview will come to an end, but I would like us to talk one or two issues and probably come back to the digital divide. The digital global economy will be roughly $29 trillion by 2028. That's 3 years from now. When you look at the map of the world, Summit of the Future, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Millennium Development Goals completely put aside, you see the behavior of governments, misinformation and all of that. You put that in a single package. How do you read the future?
I think the future of AI is mixed. If we take continents like Africa.
Artificial intelligence is just one element of that digital transformation going on in the world.
There are other components, for example, like gene editing, there is also what I mentioned earlier, the scramble for space, with potential implications of us having new wars.
Cyber criminality,
yes, cyber criminality and hate speech and etc. Yeah. But one very pertinent issue that young people raised on the African continent, because I also worked with the African Working Group within the Pledge Network, that consists of over 150 civil society organizations in the world that was influencing the process of the summit. One of the things that we were hitting hard on as Africans is the fact that most of our governments don't care about where our data is stored. Because now there is a transition from minerals like gold or oil being the place of conflict or being the place of tensions and being the mine for money into a new gold mine, which is our digital data. Although, yes, we must salute some efforts that are coming out, because first we have this overall agreement that through the digital compact from the UN, and a number of countries, including Cameroon and other countries, Nigeria, for example, they have come out with recent laws about maybe privacy and trying to tackle AI and technology, but the overall impression is that that is very, very minimal, very limited, and we need to go further. Because even now, as we speak, unless I'm mistaken, on the African continent, only one country has a solid database storage facility, which should be South Africa. So where is Facebook keeping our data? Where is TikTok keeping our data? And they can use it to do anything.
So when you completely put that question on the table, which has to do with my digital identity or your digital identity, community's digital identities, roughly 14 billion videos are found on YouTube. The question is, who manages our data online and whatsoever? Is that a potential threat to security?
Yes, very much. That's a serious threat to security. We take WhatsApp, we take Facebook, which are, I think, the most used apps, and also TikTok on the continent, and now YouTube you've added. The countries that have control over this data, they can be able to influence and to meddle a lot into our internal issues throughout the continent. Wherever we are weak, that can be done. And now we are also seeing the rise of billionaires, California-fabricated billionaires who can be able to intervene and to influence political and other kinds of processes in different countries around the world, because they have access to data and which normally should not be in their hands. So we need to think seriously, because if you see, for example, the wars in quotes between America and China over access to technologies that are sensitive, or you see Western countries banning TikTok in their countries, it's not for no reason. That should tell us that there is a serious warfare, and that's because of the implications of who keeps whose data.
Dr. Nsah, the world therefore adopted the Global Pact for the Future. Implementation may pose a problem, like many other previous gatherings around the world, specifically for African communities, that there were some engagements which were taken. How do you look at its implementation process?
Yeah. The implementation is a very important phase, because like you said, if we don't implement, then there was no need gathering in New York and also the prior work to New York. So at the level of New York, President of the General Assembly, Philemon Yang, who is Cameroonian, is organizing other aspects post-summit, especially informal dialogues. But I want to highlight something that is very important in terms of the involvement and the contribution of non-state actors, particularly the work of civil society or non-governmental organizations, because we are working with a number of organizations to drive implementation on a global scale. And one good way to go about this is to have like pilot countries and phases. So we have countries to build on already, like the case of Wales that I highlighted earlier, that have a Future Generation Commissioner. The UN has promised to appoint a special envoy for future generations. But we also have, for example, Finland, that has one of the longest standing committee for the future in Parliament. And so we have these examples around the world, but we also want to build particularly on the African continent. So we want to highlight strongly the African continent, because we know that the youth, the biggest proportion of global youth are here, and the biggest proportion of future generations will also be on the African continent. So what this means is that we have worked with some pilot countries. We are working with the Senate of Kenya, that has a Senate caucus already for future generations, and we have also had other pilot countries to work with, like Botswana, like Cameroon, like Senegal and also Morocco. And the partners that are working with us together are the School of International Futures and then UNESCO Most Bridges Coalition, including the University of Columbia. I'm coordinating their hub. And we take Cameroon very seriously, not only because Prime Minister Philemon Yang, who is former Prime Minister Philemon Yang, who is now the President of the Assembly, and he deliberated or presided over the summit and the pact adoption, but particularly because Cameroon is very important for Africa and the world. If Cameroon succeeds, Africa will succeed. It's not for any reason. It's not for no reason that we are Africa in miniature.
Our interview is taking place few hours before the inauguration of Donald Trump as the next president of the United States. And most of the issues you have raised here are basically on building a world where multilateralism is at the center of global action. That is an issue Donald Trump sees it from a unilateral perspective. For climate change advocates and activists like you, for advocates of multilateralism like yourself, for people involved in seeing that democracy, environmental concerns are addressed collectively, you should be in a very worrisome time, right?
Yeah, sure. And but there is something that comforts me, at least, that America has strong institutions, and also that this is not Trump's first time in power. Sometimes I joke to people and I say, I don't really know any new worse thing that Trump will do than maybe start a war. If it doesn't start a war, I think we already know the issues on which we disagree with Trump, particularly on climate and on multilateralism. I would not say he's completely against multilateralism, but I think that his approach is one that sometimes is quite unpredictable. But I think I disagree with him on the climate crisis. And we need to sit up because we don't know if Trump...
Is California enough testimony for him, the wildfires?
And that is where the problem is. Before California, very recently, there was also Florida, but you've seen that there are always new narratives of climate denialism that are constructed around these events, but science clearly demonstrates that these are impacts, or even when they are natural occurrences, they have been exacerbated by the climate crisis. And so that's why I think that other countries, including China, which is also quite a heavy polluting country, but Europe, the EU, and the UK, and the rest of the world, including Africa, democracy is globally in crisis, but it's something that works. But we need to, if we don't reimagine democracy, we are going to be in much more difficulty. So we need to do that, and to do that, we need to give more power to the people through citizen assemblies, through participatory foresight activities, and also giving them so that we can unleash our potential for creativity, and also make sure that at the same time we respect human dignity, human rights, and that we build a world of peace, a world of mutual respect, and a world of no war, so that future generations will not consider us as bad ancestors.
And with that, we conclude the interview. Dr. Nsah, thank you very much indeed for being my guest.
Thank you, Charles, for having me.
You're welcome.